Today we are going to begin with our invocation, which will be presented by Melinda Haynes.
Good afternoon. All Hallows Eve falls on the 31st of October each year and is the day before All Hallows Day, also known as All Saints' Day in the Christian calendar. The church traditionally held a vigil on All Hallows Eve when worshipers could prepare themselves with prayers and fasting prior to the feast day itself. The name derives from the Old English hallowed, meaning holy or sanctified, and is now usually contracted to the more familiar word Halloween. Growing up in the United Methodist Church, I didn't know much about saints. It seemed we only talked about them but once a year, always around the time of Halloween, and it took me a long time to understand the connection and who the saints were that we were talking about. I confess I was fully into middle age before my understanding of the saints became complete, when I sat in church next to a dear friend whose mother had passed several months before, and her name was listed in the worship folder along with many others. As the bells tolled for each saint in our congregation, I clasped her hand in memory of her mother, and we shared a few tears in quiet celebration of our second generation of friendship, since our mothers had been friends as well. And a few years later, when my own father passed, the bell tolling was a comforting reminder of what he meant to me. In preparing this invocation, I did what any mother of a third-year divinity student would do, and I texted my daughter to explain my need for today. She responded immediately with an official UMC prayer for this year's All Saints' Day, but it seemed a little ordinary to me. So I did a little more research and found this prayer meditation from 2010 buried deep in the United Methodist Church website. I hope it brings you fond memories of the saints in your life. We give you thanks, O God, for all the saints who ever worshiped you, whether in brush arbors or cathedrals, weathered wooden churches or crumbling cement meeting houses, where your name was lifted and adored. We give you thanks, O God, for hands lifted in praise, manicured hands, and hands stained with grease or soil, strong hands, and those gnarled with age, holy hands used as wave offerings across the land. We thank you, God, for hard-working saints, whether hard-hatted or steel-booted, head-ragged or aproned, blue-collared or three-piece suited. They left their mark on the earth for you, for us, for our children to come. Thank you, God, for the tremendous sacrifices made by those who have gone before us. Bless the memories of your saints, God. May we learn how to walk wisely from their examples of faith, dedication, worship, and love.
Thank you, Melinda, for that beautiful invocation. Today is our first memorial for the 2021-22 club year. Very appropriate, as Melinda mentioned, given that we are approaching All Saints' Day. Today our memorial is for Dr. Mike Mastrangelo and is presented by Quester and past Chair Cheryl Colvin. Cheryl.
Quester Michael John Mastrangelo, MD, passed away April 18, 2021. He was 93. He joined the Quest Club in 1997. Dr. Mike, as he was affectionately known, was born in New Jersey and graduated from Georgetown University Medical School. He served in the United States Medical Corps during the Korean War and received the Army's Commendation in Combat Medics Medal. He completed his surgical residency at Kings County Hospital in Brooklyn. Thereafter, in 1959, he moved to Fort Wayne and established a practice of general surgery, vascular surgery, and thoracic surgery with Dr. August Tommy Tomask, which continued until Mike's retirement in 1991. His surgical practice started many innovations in Fort Wayne, including the first renal dialysis and aggressive approach to trauma surgery and the initiation of cardiovascular or cardiothoracic surgery. He served his profession as chair of the Indiana State Medical Society, chair of the Fort Wayne Allen County Medical Foundation, as president of the Northeast Indiana Heart Association, and served the boards of Lutheran Hospital and Fort Wayne Allen County Medical Societies, among others. The hundreds of patients and thousands of their relatives were very appreciative of Dr. Mike's quality medical care, and they regularly greeted him and thanked him when he was out in a public setting. And he acknowledged them and expressed his remembrance. Quester Bill Clark, MD, reports that, quote, Dr. Mike and his professional partner introduced innovative and advanced practices for whom the rest of us were very fortunate recipients. One or the other of them was always just a phone call away, close quote. Now, when Dr. Mike retired from surgery, he commenced a second 30-year career devoted to public service in the Fort Wayne area, for which he was recognized when he received Indiana's highest award, the Sagamore of the Wabash, in 2017. In 2014, he was the first recipient of the Fort Wayne Medical Society's Exemplar Award for his attributes of professionalism, competence, leadership, and service. Alphabetically, these are the organizations he served. Dr. Mike started with the Allen County Public Library, not started, but alphabetically. Allen County Public Library as president of the Friends of the Library, and as a board member of the Allen County Public Library Foundation for 27 years. He served as on the advisory committee of Big Brothers Big Sisters in Northeast Indiana for 28 years. His guidance and leadership caused the organization to grow from 20 matches to serving 2,000 children today, and by serving on this growth campaign and steering committee, raised $6 million to create a sustainable organization to serve 5,000 children with a caring adult mentor. Dr. Mike served as a member of the Fort Wayne Museum of Art, on its board and on its finance and investment committee for 11 years. Quester Charles Shepard, CEO of the Fort Wayne Museum of Art, describes him as a generous friend of the museum in both terms of treasure and time. Dr. Mike served on the Fort Wayne Philharmonic Orchestra for 28 years as a member of the board of directors, as chairman twice of the board, and as acting CEO for 2 years. He received the Helene Follinger Award in 2007 for his service as acting as CEO. Board member Eleanor Marine, widow of Quester Lockwood Marine, reported that Dr. Mike stepped up to serve the board as president the second time at a particularly contentious moment in the orchestra's history. It was his calming nature, decency, and basic integrity that steered the board through that troubled time. Dr. Mike also served the Junior Achievement of Northern Indiana for 30 years as director and secretary, and as Junior Achievement Foundation director and vice president until his death. He received from the Junior Achievement the Bronze and Silver Leadership Award and the O.V. Jorgensen Spirit of Leadership Award. Dr. Mike thought that, quote, humble leaders have more influence, they attract better people, and they can earn more confidence, trust, and loyalty than those who rely on ego and power, close quote. Dr. Mike served 2 full 9-year terms on the board of St. Joseph Community Health Foundation. From this platform, he stepped in as acting director of the Matthew 25 Medical Clinic. In 2000, its board members unanimously nominated him for the Raymond Rosenberger Manette Baum Award. This award is for exceptional service to indigent people in our community with a hefty cash award. Dr. Mike reluctantly accepted the award and donated back the proceeds to several charities in the community. He served Matthew 25 Medical Clinic in Fort Wayne for 30 years and received its Fabric of the Community Award. In 2008, Dr. Mike was invited to serve on the University of St. Francis Board of Trustees. Significant growth to the university occurred during those years, and he was granted emeritus trusteeship in 2017. And in 2020, he received an honorary Doctor of Letters degree. Dr. Mike was preceded in death by his wife Grace, of 55 years, whom he credits always serving with him, and finding her was his biggest achievement. 2 daughters, Patricia, Mary Ann, and 2 sons, Angelo and Anthony, also preceded him in death. He's survived by 2 daughters, Nina of Santa Fe, New Mexico, and Paula of Cary, North Carolina, 2 sons, Michael MD of Bend, Oregon, and Vincent in Birmingham, Michigan. Among his favorite survivors are 11 grandchildren. Throughout his life, Dr. Mike was committed to his Roman Catholic faith. Mike and Grace were weekly participants at Mass. Bishop Kevin Rhodes of the Diocese of Fort Wayne South Bend said, quote, Dr. Mike's love for his family, friends, patients, co-workers, fellow parishioners, and his community was a sincere gift of himself, close quote. It is accurate to say that Michael Mastrangelo was a remarkable man and left the world a better place. He is and will be missed.
Thank you for such a loving memorial, Cheryl. I add my name to the list of the many, many people that Dr. Mike mentored. He was one of my first mentors when I came to Fort Wayne. Today's paper is presented by Kathy Sessions and is titled The Politics of Myanmar. Kathy is a retired chemistry teacher who taught at Canterbury High School and at IPFW. She's also taught geology and astronomy. Kathy is married to Orrin, a real estate developer, and they have been married for 57 years. She and Orrin have 2 sons, David, who lives in Durango, Colorado, and Chris, who lives in Asheville, North Carolina. Both sons are involved in computers, David in hardware and Chris in software. Kathy holds a Bachelor of Science from Weber State College and a Master's of Science from Indiana University. She has many years of community service, most recently Little River Wetlands Project, Philharmonic Friends, and Friends of the Library. Kathy loves to, and this is a long list, she's a busy lady, downhill ski, hike, bike, garden, and travel with Orrin to exotic places. She has been a member of Quest Club since 2016, and her paper today is The Politics of Myanmar. Kathy?
Good afternoon. Can you hear me? Okay. They say that a picture is worth 1,000 words, so we should all have just some little items about Burma, Myanmar, and a map of Myanmar. Before I begin, I'd like to thank 4 people who took time from their busy schedules to meet with me and share information about the Burmese. Tom Herr and Dorothy Kataka, who with others from Fort Wayne traveled to Myanmar in 2017 to select a town for a sister city for Fort Wayne. John Meyer, son of fellow quester Susie Meyer, who has tutored Burmese refugees in Fort Wayne, and Melissa Singh, who works for Amani with newly arrived refugees, including those from Myanmar. And my husband, Orrin, who has read my paper in all stages of development and helped me cut huge chunks of really important information from the paper to reduce it from over an hour to a reasonable size. A little vignette from Seinfeld. Elaine says, Peterman ran off to Burma. Seinfeld, isn't it Myanmar now? Kramer, wait, Myanmar, isn't that the discount pharmacy? Some true facts on Myanmar. On February 1st of this year, a military coup halted Myanmar's latest progress towards democracy. Aung San Suu Kyi, popular leader of the National League for Democracy, has been imprisoned along with members of her party. The UN has condemned the coup, but is unlikely to take any meaningful action against Myanmar's new rulers because, quote, they have the support of China and Russia. Both are among top arms suppliers for Myanmar. Aung San Suu Kyi visited Fort Wayne in 2012. She visited only 4 cities in the United States on that trip. George Orwell, real name Eric Arthur Blair, served as an officer of the Imperial Police Force of Burma in the mid-1920s. After leaving Burma, he wrote, among other novels, Burmese Days, Animal Farm, and 1984, said to be a trilogy recounting the brutal history of Burma under British rule and beyond. The only book not banned in Myanmar is Burmese Days. Fort Wayne, where more than 10,000 Burmese currently live, was in the process of creating a sister city in Myanmar. The February coup halted that project. Myanmar wasn't the country's name until 1989. Before that, it was called Burma. When the ruling military generals changed the name, they justified it by saying the name Myanmar incorporated all the country's indigenous peoples. As with other ruling junta statements, this was untrue. Few minorities, if any, would claim that the word historically applied to them. Current-day Myanmar is the largest country in mainland Southeast Asia, a bit smaller than the state of Texas. It is sandwiched between India and China, a fact that contributes to Myanmar's continuous political turmoil. In addition to India and China, it shares borders with Bangladesh, Thailand, and Laos. The Himalayas are just north of the country. Myanmar is shaped like a kite with a tail. The Irrawaddy River is the main river in Myanmar. To the north of Myanmar, 2 Himalayan rivers join to form the Irrawaddy, which flows from north to south for 1,300 miles down the center of the country, emptying into the Irrawaddy Delta and the Andaman Sea. For centuries, Burma was a country ruled by legendary warrior kings with mighty armies. Kings riding elephants invaded the lands around Burma, expanding the country's territory. Great national pride was and is today taken in Burma's amazing military conquests. Myanmar is a country rich in natural resources. Unfortunately, the military junta today has control of those resources. 90% of the world's teak grew in the country in 1990. Now, revenue-driven production has decimated the forests. The Kachin region has spectacularly rich imperial jade mines, as well as Burmese rubies, sapphires, and other gems. Since 2011, the jade industry has been controlled by a network of military elites, drug lords, and their cronies. Natural gas has reported netting nearly $1 billion annually in recent years. In the wake of the February 2021 coup, the military has regained control of state oil companies. Myanmar is the world's 6th largest rice-producing country. Rice is the country's most important crop due to Myanmar's favorable weather for rice paddies. The junta is now in charge of rice production, using Myanmar farmers for the work and leaving those workers with no rice for themselves. Myanmar has the world's largest captive elephant population, and the vast majority of them still work as timber elephants. All elephants are registered with the government, which keeps records that document their work and their medical history. Myanmar is a devoutly religious country. As much as 90% of the population practices Theravada Buddhism, the oldest and most conservative branch of Buddhism. Aung San Suu Kyi practices this form of Buddhism. Christianity is the 2nd largest religion in Myanmar, making up just under 5% of the population. Many of the ethnic minorities in Myanmar are Christian, such as the Chin, the Kachin, and the Karen. The 3rd largest religion in Myanmar is Islam. Officially, 4% of the inhabitants are Muslim. In this predominantly Buddhist country, Muslims are often discriminated against by the powerful nationalist movement that strives to protect Buddhist identity. The country's official language, Burmese, is spoken by the majority and is as, quote, dissimilar to English or to any other Indo-European language as possible. It is very tonal, says Melissa Singh of Amani, who works with Burmese refugees in Fort Wayne. In addition to Burmese, there are literally hundreds of indigenous languages. These languages are not mere dialects, but completely separate languages. Burma became a colony of the British in 1824 after the first of 3 Anglo-Burmese wars. A disastrous naval battle occurred in which the English sailed up the Irrawaddy River to meet the Burmese Navy with its huge teak warboats over 100 feet long, each propelled with up to 60 oarsmen and 30 musketeers and fitted with 6 to 12-pounder guns. But the British had a new weapon, a ship called Diana, built the year before. She was not very large, but she had a 60-horsepower steam engine and a few small cannons and rockets. Her strength? She could navigate up the rivers faster than the Burmese could row their boats. When the giant Burmese boats attacked the Diana, she simply steamed away from them until the Burmese rowers were exhausted. Then she could steam up to them one by one and sink them with her small cannons. The Burmese king's navy was decimated. Nearly all the royal treasure, about $2 billion in today's terms, were emptied in the coffers of the English ships. A whole generation of men were wiped out on the battlefield, and the world the Burmese knew of conquest and martial pride came crashing down. All subsequent nationalist thinking harkens back to this moment, when the empire was brought to its knees by invaders from the West. The late 20th century military regime would make 1824 the cutoff date in determining who belonged in Burma and who did not, whose ancestors were natives and whose came as a result of foreign occupation and therefore were at best guests. This delineation is still at play in 2021, as is seen with Rohingya. In 1885, after the Third Anglo-Burma War, Burma's last king, King Thibaw, and the royal family were exiled to a secluded town in British-occupied India. Thus ended the reign of a centuries-long monarchy. The modern state of Myanmar was born as a military occupation. For the British, Burma was always backwater. General Ne Win and his Revolutionary Council, more than a half a century later, viewed the Burmese in the same way, arguing that the Burmese were not suited for democratic government, and that for all the good things about them, they needed to learn discipline and teamwork. Life came too easily to the Burmese. They had to work harder, learn to do things for themselves. They certainly didn't need to be too educated. When the British separated Burma from India in 1937, they created the Burma of today, with its modern borders based on racial identity. During World War II, Aung San, father of Aung San Suu Kyi, and an ardent socialist, formed the Burma National Army to battle for independence from British rule. After the war, Aung San became involved in Burma's interim government. He was instrumental in negotiating Burma's independence from Britain in January 1947. Aung San and his ministers began drafting a new constitution, but just months before the actual handover of power, Aung San and several members of his cabinet were murdered by an opposition politician. Aung San's colleague, U Nu, succeeded him, and Burma finally became independent of Britain on January 4th, 1948 at 4:20 a.m., a time chosen for its auspiciousness by an astrologer. The British left behind a democratic socialist regime. With the strident nationalism that gripped the country, anything with a connection to the British was rejected. Burma decided not to join the British Commonwealth, unlike other colonies that had also gained independence. Despite skirmishes in parts of the country, the 1950s were a time of relative peace. The economy began to recover, and the Constitution guaranteed a level of autonomy for the ethnic minority states. But in 1962, the leader of the army, General Ne Win, seized power from the elected government that existed in the 1950s. He launched a disastrous mix of Marxism and Buddhism, sealing the country off from the world. His military transformed Burma, a country abundant in natural resources, into a wasteland. After 25 years of Ne Win's rule, the United Nations declared Burma one of the world's least developed countries. At 8 minutes past 8 in the morning, on the 8th day of the 8th month of 1988, students called for a nationwide general strike to bring down the Ne Win's socialistic dictatorship. After nearly 3 decades of severely oppressive military rule, the government response was brutal and swift. That evening, the military met the demonstrators in the street, using machine guns to mow down the protesters. In Rangoon, doctors and nurses, overwhelmed by the wounded, hung a sign outside the general hospital, begging the soldiers to stop killing people. The sign was written with the blood of the wounded and dead. When a column of nurses in their white uniforms joined the protest in the streets, they too were shot. Among the dead were high school students, teachers, and monks. Smoke billowed from crematoriums as the authorities rapidly disposed of the corpses. By the end of the massacre, over 3,000 people had been shot or bludgeoned to death by government soldiers. 2 weeks later, the army reasserted control. This was the end of what became known as the 1988 uprising. The uprising failed, but the old socialist state was formally abolished. The army now took direct control. A week after the worst of the violence, Aung San Suu Kyi, a Burmese woman living in Oxford, England, with her husband, happened to be in Rangoon caring for her sick mother. She left her mother's home to talk to the people standing in front of a huge portrait of her father, Aung San, saying, "I couldn't, as my father's daughter, remain indifferent to all that was going on." Thus began Suu Kyi's involvement with the politics of Burma. Suu Kyi, with her charismatic ways, quickly became a popular proponent of democracy and human rights and a foe of the military junta. She was first arrested in 1989 and has been repeatedly arrested by Burma's military rulers for her popularity with the Burmese. She has spent more than 15 years under house arrest at her family home before her 2010 release. When she was released for the first time, it soon became apparent that her popularity remained undiminished. The authorities placed barbed wire barricades at each end of the street on which she lived and resorted to publicly ridiculing her. Photographs of Suu Kyi were forbidden from circulating in Burma. In 1992, with the retirement of Ne Win, the military placed a new leader, General Than Shwe, in charge. It was widely believed that he would be more moderate than his predecessors. He promised a new direction for the country. A national convention was held to draft a new constitution and prepare the country for eventual democracy. This was a stage-managed exercise which sought to preserve military dominance. The democratic reforms that many had hoped for never took place. Members of the National League for Democracy walked out of the process. After John McCain visited Rangoon in June 1995, Suu Kyi was released from home arrest. Madeleine Albright visited that September. Aung San Suu Kyi wrote 2 years after in an op-ed in the New York Times, "Please use your liberty to promote ours." In 2000, Bill Clinton awarded Suu Kyi with the Presidential Medal of Freedom in absentia. By that time, Suu Kyi was back under house arrest. In May of 2003, Suu Kyi was again released from house arrest and traveling around the country giving open-air speeches that called for an end to military rule. Not far from Mandalay, her convoy was ambushed in an attempted assassination, and dozens were killed. Suu Kyi, her driver, and some other NLD members managed to escape, but she was again put under house arrest. The attack was ordered by General Than Shwe, who has an extreme dislike for Suu Kyi. In response, 2 months later, the U.S. imposed on Myanmar the toughest economic sanctions in the world, virtually cutting Myanmar off from the global economy. In 2005, Condoleezza Rice listed Myanmar as an outpost of tyranny. At her home with David Rockefeller in early 2003, Aung San Suu Kyi joked about those who advised her to be patient with the generals and to go slow, saying, "Slow is one thing, a snail's pace is another. The longer it takes," she warned, "the more difficult it will be to restart the country under a new government." She worried about the state of the education system and expressed concern that Myanmar would soon become a country of uneducated people with terrible consequences for the nation's political and economic rule. In 2007, the Elders, a new group that included Bishop Desmond Tutu, Jimmy Carter, and Kofi Annan, who had just retired from the UN, met to find a way to become involved in Myanmar. The poor in Rangoon, mostly migrants from the countryside who had lost their land to army and crony capitalist confiscations, were desperate. Meetings were held to protest the high prices of food, health, education, and electricity. On August 15th, with no warning, the government hiked fuel prices by 500%, which led to an immediate spike in bus fare. Buses were the only transportation available to most workers to get to work. protesters were arrested. On September 5, 2007, in a small town not far from Mandalay and home to dozens of Buddhist monasteries, hundreds of saffron and crimson-clad monks organized a protest of their own to support the detained demonstrators in Rangoon. Police beat 3 of the monks. Myanmar's approximately 400,000 monks and Buddhist leaders demanded an official apology from the government. When no apology was offered, monks took to the streets in Rangoon, Mandalay, and other towns across the country. They refused to perform religious rituals for government officials, army officials, and their families. This was an extremely serious step in a devoutly religious society. On September 22, 2007, thousands of monks walked Rangoon Street past the front of Suu Kyi's house. Still under house arrest, she hadn't appeared in public for years, but now, under a monsoon downpour, she opened her gate and stood by the roadside to accept their blessing. The crackdown began within a week. The army opened fire on protesters, raided monasteries, defrocked and arrested monks. This happened just as world leaders were congregating in New York for the annual UN General Assembly. October 24th, UN Day, Charles Petrie and other heads of UN agencies in Rangoon issued a statement drawing attention to the plight of the country's poorest, saying this had been the purpose of the Buddhist monks' protests. They included a figure for poverty that was far worse than the government's official statistics. Within days, Charles Petrie was ordered to leave the country. What really riled the junta was not criticism of their repression, but criticism of their economic performance. These protests came to be known as the Saffron Revolution. Rumors began circulating in 2007 about Then Shui's failing health. Despite this, he oversaw the ratification of a new national constitution in 2008 and parliamentary elections in 2010, the first in 20 years. Having led Myanmar's military since 1992, he began dismantling the junta, removing the other generals close to his age. The entire secret police system was disbanded. More than 30,000 junior officers and soldiers in the intelligence service were dismissed. Political prisoners were released. A week after the election, Aung San Suu Kyi was released from house arrest. Although many countries condemned the vote as a sham, the junta claimed that the 2010 elections marked the transition from military rule to a civilian democracy. In March 2011, Then Shui retired from his position as head of state and government. He also stepped down from the military, but only after setting up all government appointees. His choice for the new head of Myanmar's armed forces, Min Aung Hlaing, a protege and incidentally leader of the February 1st, 2021 coup. And his choice for president was former Prime Minister Thein Sein. Thein Sein had a reputation of being Mr. Clean, in part because his family had no business ties whatsoever. He had never wanted to be president, but he said, I'm a soldier and have to take the task given to me and do the best I can. I asked myself, what do the people really want? I felt that for ordinary people, the most important things were to have enough food to eat, to send their kids to school, even if they have no money, and to have access to health care. Growing up poor in a village, what I wanted more than anything was to improve the lives of villagers. This was my deepest desire. The years 2011 and 12 were years of reform brought about by, quote, efforts of individuals who took advantage of a new dynamic to finally do something positive for Burma. Obama and Hillary Clinton visited Myanmar in 2011. Suu Kyi told Obama that the Americans should be thinking about, quote, rewards, not punishments. Thein Sein told Hillary that he wanted to learn more about U.S. Congress. She suggested otherwise. In early 2012, the 600 or so newly appointed members of Parliament met almost daily to discuss matters such as tax evasion, low internet connectivity, the high cost of schooling, and press censorship. These discussions were not only freely debated, but reported almost verbatim the next day in the state-run media. The new president, in his inaugural speech, highlighted the need for not only governance, good governance, but clean governance. Workers were allowed to form unions. A bill was negotiated with the National League for Democracy to allow the party to again become a legal entity with Aung San Suu Kyi as its leader. The generals and ex-generals were uneasy at the extent to which Thein Sein and some of his ministers were veering away from Than Shui's original script. Aung San Suu Kyi wasn't meant to be a part of the picture at all. On January 13, 2012, hundreds of political prisoners were released, among them the student organizers of the 1988 uprising, the Buddhist monks who led protests in the 2007 Saffron Revolution, and activists from many different ethnic minorities. On April 1, 2012, for the first time since 1990, the National League of Democracy participated in elections. The NLD won 43 out of 45 seats, and Aung San Suu Kyi became a member of parliament. People were thrilled to be able to vote freely and to openly show their disdain for the generals. America and the European Union almost immediately relaxed sanctions on Myanmar. Myanmar was rejoining the world. Myanmar, however, was not on the verge of peace. What had taken place in the course of 2011 and 12 was not a transition to democracy, but rather a greater political freedom combined with resumed relationships with the West. Hostilities continue to rage along Myanmar's borders. Along the border with China, ex-generals from the Than Shui era still traded in money and power. Tensions between the Myanmar Army and the Kachin Independent Organization intensified. Thousands of men, women, and children fled their homes. No one knows how much money was made from jade, timber, illicit drugs, and sex trafficking from the Kachin region. It was undoubtedly in the billions, possibly tens of billions of dollars a year. Compare that to the income of the average Burmese of less than $1,000 a year. On August 25, 2017, Myanmar's army attacked the Rohingya Muslims. The Rohingya have their own language and culture and are descendants of Arab traders, and other groups have been in the region for generations. The government considers them illegal immigrants from Bangladesh. In a deadly crackdown, they killed thousands and thousands of men, women, and children, and sent more than 700,000 people fleeing across the border into Bangladesh in what is being called an example of ethnic cleansing. At least 288 villages were partially or totally destroyed by the fire in northern Rakhine. Nikki Haley, American UN ambassador, called what was happening a brutal, sustained campaign to cleanse the country of an ethnic minority. A UN report in August 2018 accused Myanmar's military of mass killings and rapes with genocidal intent. The issues of blood and belonging have consigned the Rohingya Muslims to second-class status, just as the 1824 cutoff date of natives versus guests ordained. In March of 2019, Bangladesh said that it would no longer accept any Rohingya fleeing Myanmar. Though an agreement was reached for the return of refugees to Myanmar, none returned and would not consider going back until Myanmar guaranteed they would be given citizenship. There was no place for them to go. Many of their villages had been destroyed by the military, razed to make way for government facilities. The Gambia, a small Muslim nation in West Africa, brought a case to the International Court of Justice, the top court of the UN, on behalf of dozens of Muslim countries. Suu Kyi, as leader of Myanmar, was ordered to court to defend the Myanmar army against the charges of mass murder, rape, and arson. Suu Kyi herself is not being charged. The military is. When she appeared in court in December 2019, Aung San Suu Kyi denied that genocide had occurred. Discussing the Rohingya crisis with the Washington Post, Suu Kyi said, "The whole thing is a rigmarole. I'm not saying there are no difficulties," Suu Kyi told news reporters in December, "but it helps if people recognize the difficulty and are more focused on resolving these difficulties rather than exaggerating them so that everything seems worse than it really is." Suu Kyi's attitude toward the Rohingya has diminished her stellar reputation in some quarters of international opinion, but she is still adored by tens of millions in Myanmar. On February 1st, 2021, democratically elected members of the country's ruling party, the National League for Democracy, were deposed by military commander-in-chief General Min Aung Hlaing, the appointee of General Than Shwe. Min Aung Hlaing is directly implicated in crimes against humanity committed during the military's clearance operations against Rohingya Muslims in 2017, as well as other war crimes. Results of the November 2020 general election, in which the NLD won 396 out of 476 seats, were declared invalid. The military had won only 33 seats. Aung San Suu Kyi was charged with breaching emergency COVID-19 pandemic restrictions and for illegally importing and using communication and radio devices and a walkie-talkie, all of which need special military clearance, among other charges. Suu Kyi remains detained and has met no outside persons since June 7th of this year, when she met briefly with her legal team. 76-year-old Aung San Suu Kyi faces a potential prison sentence of 75 years. Emma Larkin in Finding George Orwell in Burma quotes Tintin Lay, a former history professor at Rangoon University, with the following, quote, "Before the Second World War, Burma was one of the richest countries in the region. Since then, civil wars have raged across Burma's border areas, taking an unknown toll on lives and natural resources, and the military regime has outlasted almost all other dictatorships around the world. Tintin blames all Burma's woes on a streak of authoritarianism that she believes runs through Burmese society. Before the British arrived in Burma, the country was ruled by an absolute monarchy. We Burmese spent 8 centuries living under these all-powerful monarchs," she said. "A Burmese king could kill you or destroy you or arrest you, whatever he wanted. As a result," she argued, "the Burmese have become conditioned to authoritarian rule. We are trained to listen to our elders. We are trained to obey." In other words, the Burmese have a psychological receptiveness to authoritarian government. End of quote. Perhaps the democracy the Burmese are striving for has a different connotation than the democracy for people in the West.